When Gwen Robinson received her master's degree in criminal justice, she had no idea how soon she'd have to use it. In the spring of 2003, she began tracking the mysterious life of a minister named Anthony Owens. For months, she dug into his past, talking to people in 5 states, tracing phone calls and financial records, even donning a disguise and staking out his church. She uncovered a 13-year string of cons and dirty deals that eventually sparked a nationwide manhunt. But what she discovered about his string of past wives was most shocking of all, because Reverend Owens was Gwen's husband. As a single mother of 2 teenage children and a 20-year veteran of the U.S. Air Force, Gwen Robinson has faced and overcome more than a few challenges in her life. And in the spring of 2002, recently retired from the Air Force, she was looking forward to new challenges.
I had saved up money. I had just purchased a brand new car as a retirement gift to myself. So I was very happy. I was very content with my life.
But the biggest test of Gwen's strength was yet to come. After a whirlwind romance and hasty marriage, Gwen would find herself in the midst of a desperate quest to uncover the lies and crimes of the man she thought she loved. In June of 2002, Gwen left her home in Mississippi and headed to Houston to apply for a job with the courts. She hoped the degree in criminal justice she received while in the Air Force would launch her on a new and exciting career.
I had to take some qualifying exams, take the typing tests, and all the other requirements for that job.
Back at the hotel that afternoon, Gwen had just dropped a couple of quarters into a newspaper rack when she was approached by a young man named Anthony Owens.
I was bending down, and all of a sudden I looked up and Anthony was standing there. He had the smile on his face and introduced himself.
The young man said he was the head of a ministry that was moving to Houston from Kansas City. When Gwen mentioned she was in town for a job interview, he suggested she drop by the hotel conference room to interview for a job with his new church. The next day, Gwen took him up on it.
Anthony was a very charming person. He had a nice smile. His demeanor was not one that you would even expect to be deceptive.
He offered her the job as chief executive officer, but Gwen got the sense Bishop Owens had a larger role for her in mind.
We did discuss how his church members wanted him to find a wife because, all ministers had to have a first lady.
After the interview, Gwen headed home to Mississippi to consider the move. Anthony arrived on her doorstep a few weeks later.
Anthony just shows up saying that God had given him this vision that I was the one. I was his wife and God had sent me to him.
Though it was certainly sudden, Gwen was intrigued by the proposal.
After being divorced for so many years, I'm thinking, he's honest, he's safe, he's not going to be a threat to my children.
2 months later, Gwen and Bishop Owens were married.
She was very, very happy. She finally found a man in her life that was going to be there for her.
Shortly after the marriage, Anthony announced that he'd had another vision.
He gets this idea that God has given him a message to move to Atlanta.
In October of 2002, the couple hit the road for Atlanta with big plans to start a new church and life together. But just short of the Georgia state line, Anthony's cell phone rang.
He asked me to pull over, and he goes into the gas station and speaks to whoever he talks to. And when he gets back in the car, he says, we have a problem. I said, okay, what is the problem? The problem was that the IRS had frozen all of his assets.
According to Anthony, it wasn't his fault. It was his church's previous bishops.
He tells me this person has now been charged with embezzling and all kind of legal activities.
Anthony assured Gwen that his money would come through, and they drove on to Atlanta. There, Anthony and Gwen checked into an extended stay hotel on Atlanta's north side.
We got the motel room set up as an office. Anthony hired 7 people to work for him.
Although, until Anthony's finances came through, Gwen would have to dig into her Air Force retirement fund to front the money for their paychecks.
I felt I had an opportunity to be a big part of something, so I was willing to do whatever it took to make him successful in that endeavor.
Holding services in the hotel conference room, the congregation enthusiastically grew, inspired by Anthony's impassioned preaching.
I mean, this guy was clean cut, nice, expensive, name brand, very fashionable, down to his cologne, to the way he talked, the way he moved. He was very, very smooth.
As his new church continued to expand, Anthony told Gwen he had another vision.
God again gave him a vision that he should change the name of the ministry, and he changed it to New Dominion.
By the spring of 2003, a little more than half a year into their marriage, things appeared to be going well for the new couple and the new church. Gwen couldn't have been happier.
She's in love. This individual is a bishop, and she's a religious woman. Apparently has money. She was excited.
She's married. She's with a man that she loves. Being the bishop's wife. Basically, it's the all-American story of happy ever after.
Gwen's apparent euphoria was going to be short-lived. On March 16, 2003, New Dominion Church held a special service for family and friends.
And this is a family day, big gathering at the church, and Gwen is just trying to be there for her husband, who's the bishop of the church. But a woman takes her to the side.
The woman was a minister from Alabama named Ceola Singleton, who'd known Anthony ever since he started preaching.
We kind of spoke casually, and she looked at me and she said, you know, you're a true woman of God, and God has work for you to do. After she said that, Anthony walked into the room, and she kind of froze up and she didn't say anything else. Well, now I'm curious, because I'm like, okay, if she's talking to me, why would she stop talking when Anthony walks in the room?
When the service was over, Gwen made a point to find her.
So I walk her down to her car, and she told me several things about Anthony. One of the things she said was, don't leave your purse or anything laying around, because he's going to steal from you.
And that wasn't all Ceola Singleton had to say.
She left one final word with me. She said, over the last couple of years, he has come through several times, and each time he has a different group of women with him. And every time he tells me that one of those women is his wife. So she got in her car, her and her husband, they got in their car and they left.
Standing there alone in the parking lot, Gwen was stunned.
There's so much that's going through my mind at this point. How can I find out the truth, find out what is going on with this man, and act as if nothing had happened, act as if I knew nothing about the whole situation?
I think that day everybody in the congregation noticed that Gwen was a little standoffish. That must have been the hardest and scariest thing in the world for her to do.
And it was going to get a lot harder. Gwen Robinson was about to go undercover in her own marriage to pursue the truth about her husband. And what she would find would be far worse than she expected. In the spring of 2003, Gwen Robinson had just been tipped off that her husband, Bishop Anthony Owens, may have been breaking a few commandments, especially numbers 7 and 8, thou shalt not steal and commit adultery. But Gwen wanted to gather a little evidence before she confronted her husband directly. The first thing she decided to do was to try to catch him off guard and see what he'd admit to.
She confronted Anthony and tried to play a little reverse psychology on him.
Since he has always come to me with, I had this dream, God gave me this message in a dream. I said, well, I'm going to use his same tactics and see what I can find out from him. So I told him I had a dream and that I knew everything. I knew everything. To see if he was going to talk. Anthony panics. And Anthony said to me, okay, I'm going to tell you everything. There were 4 women, but I didn't marry any of them.
And he didn't stop there.
Anthony said, I know the only person that told you this stuff was Shirley Rhodes. And from that point, I knew I had to find Shirley Rhodes.
The next morning, Gwen went to work finding Shirley Rhodes.
She gets his name, Shirley Rhodes, and she uses phone records to get her number.
When I finally was able to locate Shirley, I found out Anthony had married and had pretty much deserted her, had stolen everything from her. She had ended up homeless.
She did not, however, end up divorced. According to Shirley Rhodes, she and Anthony Owens were still married.
Gwen realized that she had been fooled, but she's not a fool. And she was going to be the wife to put an end to this charade.
But how?
Gwen had to keep this quiet because she didn't want him to run. And she knew that if he knew what she was on to, that he would run.
So Gwen went undercover inside her own marriage. She played the role of dutiful Bishop's wife when Anthony was around, but as soon as he left, she went to work digging into his past.
She did internet searches, and then she did searches in counties where she knew that he might be married to somebody.
Anthony always talked about places he had gone, places he would go singing and preaching. So I started there first, investigating those places. I said, well, at least I can check the courts and see if there are marriage licenses there.
That's a lot of legwork. That's a lot of phone calling. And it's a lot of digging and digging and digging.
Within a few weeks, Gwen turned up 7 previous marriages and only 1 divorce. So while Anthony was out doing the Lord's work, Gwen continued doing the cops' work.
Once I found my first marriage license, and I continued to find more marriage licenses, I knew that Anthony had committed a crime, and that crime was bigamy. And even though society doesn't look at bigamy as a violent crime, it is a crime that I felt had to be stopped.
While Gwen waited for copies of the marriage licenses to come in the mail, she didn't just sit around. She bought an old beat-up car, donned a disguise, and staked out her husband.
I would get in my car every day, and I'd put on old baseball hat, sunglasses, and pretty much just follow him.
I'd tease her like, what you do, rent a parrot like Beretta and sit in the car and camp out. And she goes, whatever it took.
One day, Gwen tailed Anthony to a nondescript building on Jimmy Carter Boulevard. Later, Gwen went back for a closer look. The name on the door looked awfully familiar.
Lo and behold, there it was, New Dominion Churches. It had embossed on the doors the phone number. So I went back and I tried to call the phone number, and I disguised my voice just to see. And there was an answering machine that talked about New Dominion Churches and the time the services was there.
Gwen staked out the services. Sure enough, Anthony was there. And he wasn't alone. Gwen snuck out of the service before he saw her.
He had opened up a whole other church in another side of town, and he's with another woman.
When he came home to Gwen, he acted like everything was fine. But it was obvious that Bishop Owens was up to his old tricks.
From that point on, I could not let Anthony know that I was really on to him. But I was determined not only to keep other women from having to go through the same thing, but I also didn't want him to hurt anybody else spiritually, because he was using being a minister to hurt and deceive people and to con people. So that was my drive.
But before Gwen's investigation was over, she'd discover even more disturbing news about her husband. News that would lead to a nationwide manhunt for a convicted felon. Gwen Robinson had been married for a little less than a year when she discovered her husband was also married to at least 7 other women and had conned them out of their life savings.
She was not going to let this slide by. His other wives basically said, I was wrong, I made a mistake, and moved on and tried to forget about him. But Miss Robinson wasn't going to do that.
She'd spent months gathering evidence against him. She had ordered copies of marriage licenses from 4 states. She'd even donned a disguise and followed him around Atlanta. Then, in late May, she got a message. And it wasn't from God.
I guess Anthony had used my phone at one point. Anthony's cousin called my cell phone and left a message on the phone. And it was a pretty, irate message that if you don't do what you say you're going to do, I'm going to call Tuscaloosa.
Gwen immediately called the Tuscaloosa Sheriff's Department.
So I called Tuscaloosa and say, are you looking for an individual? And I give them Anthony's name. And they say yes.
The Tuscaloosa Sheriff's Department told Gwen that her husband was a convicted felon who had skipped parole in early 2001 and had a warrant out for his arrest.
His initial charge was for first-degree rape, but the charge was reduced to sexual misconduct. He was convicted, and that's when he went on the run.
Gwen immediately called the Gwinnett County cops and turned Anthony in. She also told them right where to find him, his new church on Jimmy Carter Boulevard.
The Sheriff's Department came out and apprehended him and took him into custody.
When they actually came and apprehended him, his whole congregation and everybody was there.
Days later, after Anthony was extradited to Alabama, the last of the marriage licenses Gwen had ordered came in the mail. She went back to the cops.
When I initially walked in and saw the detectives, I had all the marriage licenses in my hand.
She had all the marriage certificates. She had all the documentation that the police needed.
What Miss Robinson had brought to me made my job quite easy. What I did basically then was contact probate court and then had to verify he was then married to women prior to Miss Robinson, and there was no civil separation of the marriage.
In October 2003, the Gwinnett County Police Department issued a warrant for the arrest of Anthony Owens on the charge of bigamy, and then they contacted Tuscaloosa. But there was a problem.
The Tuscaloosa department, for some reason, released him. So now I really have to move on this thing because he's out.
Although they were unable to determine why he'd been released, police were able to track Anthony to an Atlanta hotel. But when they arrived to make the arrest, he'd already checked out. That afternoon, Officer Mathewson called Owens' cell phone. Anthony answered.
I basically said, listen, Anthony, turn yourself in. He said he would. He said he was turning his car around and he would be there. I told him if he was not there by 4 that afternoon, I would basically consider him a fugitive from justice.
Anthony never showed. A nationwide manhunt was on.
Once he found out that the police were investigating him, he did run.
It wasn't long before the national media picked up the story of the bigamist bishop. Gwen got a call from ABC.
Good Morning America contacted me and asked if I would be interested and if I could get some of the other wives to come, and this would be a way to help them catch him because it's a nationally known show. So I agreed to do the show.
When the show aired on November 12th, Gwen made a plea for anyone with information to contact police.
I want anybody that's out there that's married to him or he's frauded or did anything to come forward and not be afraid.
Little did Gwen know at the time, Anthony was already in police custody. Earlier that week, a sharp-dressed young man had walked into a bank in Shreveport, Louisiana, and applied for a loan. The loan officer recognized him from police flyers.
I'd taken a picture of him and released it to the media, and a lot of the local news agencies ran this picture because it was an ongoing bigamy case.
After he left, the bank contacted the police. Then the loan officer called Anthony and told him that he needed to come back the next day to fill out more paperwork.
When he did, police arrested him on the bigamy charge.
On March 17, 2004, 5 months after he had gone on the run, Anthony pled guilty to 1 count of bigamy in Georgia and received a 2-year prison sentence plus 4 years of probation.
I didn't know what to do. I didn't know whether to jump up and shout. I didn't know whether to cry. I didn't know what I was going to do. But I was happy that he would do this to anyone else.
When Anthony, I guess, decided that he was going to try and sink his teeth into Gwen Robinson, he made a very big mistake. He didn't take into account her military experience, her degree in criminal justice, her investigative background, and that she's just a strong-willed individual. She was out to get justice.
And believe it or not, even Bishop Owens is thankful that Gwen had finally put an end to a string of lies and deceptions.
It has been a blessing to me that she put me here because I got a chance to clear up all my past. My ministry will never be the same. I'm much stronger now. I'm better now. And if it had not been for Gwendolyn, I wouldn't be where I am today.